Welcome, Dr. David Johnson. It's such a pleasure to have you speaking to our students and graduates at the Nutrition Academy. We met via one of your patients, actually, who have been going to you, and they just sing your praises. So I thought that our students and graduates would love to hear how a neurosurgeon and spinal surgeon has gone from surgery to changing his practice absolutely completely. So let's start with, why'd you become a medical doctor? What made you want to do this?
Okay, that goes back a long way, back into sort of high school days and thinking about what am I going to do for the rest of my life. And I suppose I've always been sort of academically driven, and it just seemed a pretty interesting area to go into. Medicine was something that I always had a bit of an interest in. I used to love animals when I grew up, as most kids do. I had about 10 dogs. I grew up in Papua New Guinea, and I was sort of leaning towards doing veterinary science. And I remember being a little village boy in a very small town called Wewak in Papua New Guinea, and every year there'd be a fly-in vet, and he would come into town and do little surgeries on the local dogs. And at one time, this vet came in and he allowed me to watch him doing surgery. I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I was actually going to do veterinary science, and then academically I was doing okay. And my mum said to me, well, if you like surgery and medicine, why don't you think about doing that on people? And so instead of doing veterinary science, I was able to enter med school back in 1990, so nearly 30 odd years ago. And then med school was such a long haul, it's just left foot, right foot for 6 years. And I enjoyed every aspect of medicine, whether I was doing a rotation in medicine or radiology or orthopedics or abdominal surgery. It just turned out that when I was ready to pick a specialty, the opportunity to do neurosurgery had come up. So it was really quite serendipitous. And then my very first day of neurosurgery, the boss, who I'd never met before, he was quite a senior neurosurgeon. He says, okay, David, this is going to be a really tough case. and I could tell that there was a lot of tension in the air about this case because it was a young girl, and it was in hindsight now I know how challenging that type of surgery is. But this was my first day of exposure to neurosurgery. And it was about an 8-hour operation, and we had the whole back of the skull opened up, and we could see her brain and her brainstem and spinal cord. And I was just like dumbfounded by what I was doing as a junior doctor, looking into the soul or the real the heart or the essence of this person's whole being. And it just had a really strong effect on me, and it made me feel really privileged that a human being would trust in you to do that, to help them in that way. And and so that was the beginning of my neurosurgical career, and here I am today.
That is absolutely incredible. So what was it that instigated your change from maybe looking in the medical model only and bouncing out to functional movement, which we're in your gym right now, aren't we? Where your clients come and do functional movement. Yeah, let everybody see this. This blows me away.
Just a shameless plug of the Functional Movement Training Centre. We're in Wollongabba, and I also have a functional training centre actually in St Andrew's Hospital, which is where my headquarters are in Brisbane, in Spring Hill. And we also have a lot of patients up on the Sunshine Coast, as you alluded to, one of our mutual patients. Well, I think it's a personal journey, I suppose, to begin with, is how I transitioned into becoming quite passionate about nutrition science. Obviously, going through med school, we learn all our biochemistry, we learn our organic chemistry, we learn our physiology. Like, that's just bread and butter for us. But I think along the way, as doctors and as specialists, we can very easily get sidetracked into the very tip of the spear type of medicine, like advanced surgery, high cost surgery, high risk surgery. And we take our eye off the ball of fundamental preventative medicine. And I think a really good saying is that modern medicine is very good at creating lifesavers, but very bad at creating swimming coaches. Because if we were actually much better swimming coaches, there would be less people drowning. And in fact, 90% of morbidity and mortality is related to a chronic disease, which is entirely preventable. So if you think about the entire medical budget, if we focused more on preventative medicine and nutrition in particular, you could have impacts that are unfathomable, versus what we seem to spend all our money on is that 10% of rescuing people once they've got diabetes, once they've got cancer, once they've got high blood pressure, once they are obese, and they're sort of, really, they're medical train wrecks, rather than just saying, hey, let's just keep you on the rails. You'll never become a train wreck. So my understanding of that sort of arrived about 10 years ago, when I admit to losing sight of the fundamental basics and the fundamental pillars of health, which are so important. And they are four. I sort of classify 4 pillars of health. One is nutrition, quality nutrition, quality sleep, quality stress management, because a little bit of stress is okay, but unhealthy stress is very bad, and quality movement. Okay, and they really form the foundation of my practice now. Movement, stress management, understanding how to sleep well, and understanding how to eat well. But I got off the rails myself, my personal journey, and I went for a life insurance check, and I was running, I was swimming, I was surfing, I was playing tennis, I was playing golf in my time off. So I figured that I was fairly fit, and I went for my own life insurance check about 10 years ago, and the doctor took my blood pressure, and it was sitting around 145, 150, and he checked it again. He knew that I was active and fit, and he said, "Oh, your blood pressure's up, David." And he said, I wasn't, it wasn't the white coat syndrome. I was quite happy talking to my doctor. It didn't cause any stress. I was relaxed, and I'd never taken my own blood pressure, and I realized that there was something that I was doing that was not right. And that was really the beginning. When I failed that life insurance medical, I realized that, hang on, even though you are active and exercising and understand clinical medicine, and you're a medical scientist, you can still get off the rails. And so it was sort of just back to the drawing boards, revisiting basic physiology, revisiting the role of insulin and carbohydrates and fat and protein, to then go, right, it was just a light bulb moment. How could I possibly have thought that waking up in the morning and having orange juice, Wheat Bix, 2 slices of bread was healthy?
Was it margarine as well?
Yeah, with margarine, because that was what we were told was healthy. Yeah. And then feeling peckish at around 11 o'clock, and my secretary is going out and getting me a croissant and a smoothie. And how could I forget that when you just do that day in, day out, you become sick? And really that was the way that my body was expressing metabolic inflammation. I had high blood pressure. I look at photos of myself back from that time, and I was just, I just had a balloon face. I had love handles. And within about 6 months of not changing any physical activity, just my normal physical activity, but just going, okay, no more bread, no more rice, no more pasta, eliminate glucose, along with confectionery, of course, because that's a barn door obvious one. But those less obvious sources of glucose, I just cut them out. And I just woke up one morning, just had a shower, looked in the mirror, and then the six-pack starts shining through. I thought, how did that happen? I sit in an office all day. That's crazy. And that was my body going, okay, thank you for removing those elements that made you inflamed. I'll reward you with having a healthy body. And I felt great. I had more energy. My brain was sharper. My physical abilities increased. It was just every metric that you could think of. My blood pressure came down. I got my life insurance policy, so that made my wife happy. and I haven't stopped since. And then, when you have those real epiphanies, you sort of feel like you've got to share them with your patients. And being a clinician, I was seeing 15, 20 patients a day. And all of a sudden, I just kept running overtime. And my secretaries were saying, why are you taking so long to do consultations? I used to only take half an hour. Now you're taking 45 minutes. Because half of the consultation might have been talking about their neurological problem or their spinal problem, but everyone was obese. Everyone was overweight. Everyone had high blood pressure. Everyone was on statins. Everyone was on antidepressants. And so I started committing half an hour of 50% of my consultation time to talking about fundamentals. And of course, nutrition came up, and then I just started surrounding myself with people like yourself, Gary Fettke, Tim Noakes, Grant Schofield, Christine Cronau, Gary Torbs. We all speaking the same language. No mumbo jumbo, just pure science, and it just makes sense. There's just no conjecture, and then that just flowed on into those other pillars, with the functional movement, and those are the two main things that we can actually intervene at to create a difference.
So can you give me some examples of some of your clients that have come in a really bad way, and you've talked to them about diet and they've taken it on, and you've talked to them about the functional movement, they've taken that on, and have they prevented surgery? Has it helped them? Can you give us some good examples of that to show people that, even in a crisis, we can come back from that?
Oh gosh, yeah. Look, I mean, a fairly classic example would be like someone who is considering having surgery because they have a structural problem with their spine, or mostly with their spine. And I'll say, look, okay, well, surgery, we can sort of consider surgery. You don't have to jump into surgery right now, but there's a chance that surgery may be required in future. Whilst we're sort of seeing how things play out, let's make some changes to your diet. And then I'll see you again in a few months' time. And it is not uncommon for me to see that patient again in 3 to 6 months' time, and they come back into the waiting room, and I cannot recognize them from the first consult, because they just transform. And they're so excited to come back and say, David, I know I came to see you because of my spinal problem, but I am cured because you told me to stop eating Wheat Bix and bread in the morning. It's profound, and I always, it's exciting. But if every patient that does that is exciting, but it's become so common now that it doesn't surprise me when patients do that. And you know, when I have patients with brain tumors, there's really a lot of emerging evidence about nutritional ketosis and the control of malignancy, because there's a new sort of paradigm shift in understanding cancer as a metabolic disease rather than a genetic disease. That the genetic dysfunction occurs secondary to mitochondrial dysfunction, which is driven by inflammation. And nutritional ketosis is one way of controlling. It's not the only thing that you need to do for a cancer. You know, you need all guns blazing at cancer, but there's absolutely no harm that comes from nutritional ketosis, and potentially a lot of gain. And so when I have patients with brain tumors, I will always say, listen, this is a terrible situation you're in, but I know you're going through chemotherapy. I know we're going to have to do a brain surgery on you, but on the side, let's also enhance your diet. And it is not uncommon for my patients with brain tumors to defy the odds when it comes to highly aggressive malignant brain tumors.
It's music to my ear. I watched the documentary First Do No Harm. I don't know if you've seen that. It came out in the 90s with Meryl Streep, and it was about a young boy who had seizures, and he was in the hospital for a long time, lots of drugs, lots of things were happening to him. And he goes to one of the hospitals in America where Millicent Kenton, who is a nutritionist who deals in ketosis, and she had been since the 40s, and within 2 days of no food, so they took food out of the diet, so put him pretty quickly into ketosis. He never had another seizure since that day.
Oh, that was the standard way of managing epilepsy, you know, in the early 1900s, because we didn't have all the drugs that were available to us now. So that was how we managed epilepsy. But nowadays, because we've got these drugs in blister packs, and okay, it's all right, just have your Dilantin or have your Tegretol, these are various drugs. It doesn't matter what you eat, because a drug can replace that type of healthy diet. But you know, it doesn't make sense that we rely on a drug when simply eating well can reduce your seizure risk. It doesn't mean that you might not also have the drug, but you might be on a fraction of the dose. The number of seizures that you have per year might be significantly reduced. So, but doctors just don't advise that anymore. They don't advise that. I attended a conference about brain tumors, and we were talking about advances in managing brain tumors with colleagues in Brisbane. And not one, we had surgeons, we had oncologists, a medical oncologist, you know, chemotherapy, we had radiation oncologists, and there was not one discussion about nutrition, not one. And again, you know, I don't know whether it was the setting, but I was thinking about, you know, raising it as a point of discussion at the end, but it was one of these webinar type of things, so it wasn't going to be convenient to raise. But I really wanted to, retrospectively, I really wanted to raise nutritional ketosis to sort of fathom out why these experts in the field are ignoring something so fundamentally valuable.
Yeah, I watched Dom D'Agostino at the Metabolic Conference in the US talk about what the emerging research is with neurological problems and as well as metabolic problems with ketosis. And this is science, hard science coming out, emerging with not only diabetes, but also brain tumors, seizures. I can't even remember. I think there was cancers, which was prostate cancer and lung cancer, I think it was. So I was hearing all of these stuff that is now emerging, yet it doesn't seem to be, except for people like you and other medical doctors that I have been, and specialists that I've been interviewing, doesn't seem to be getting into the profession. And I think I was talking to James Mukey yesterday, Dr. James Mukey, and he said that he's part of the diabetic, some diabetic thing that's happening in Australia, and he's on the board. And he said nobody was talking about diet. No, and when he brings it up, they're resistant to it, which he's just dumbfounded by. He can only say that it's industry driven rather than health driven.
Well, I think that's, there's no doubt that pharmaceutical companies create a lot of medications that are essential for people's disease management, but at the same time, and they have life-saving drugs. So you don't want to bag them completely, but at the same time, the creation of insulin, the synthesis of insulin to control blood sugar versus controlling it by not eating sugar is extremely harmful, because the diabetes guidelines is to keep blood sugar under control, blood sugar levels, not the message of minimize the requirement of insulin to keep blood sugar under control. Okay, so I can keep blood sugar under control very easily, even if you're eating chocolate cake all day. I just ramp up the insulin. Okay? But in fact, when it comes to complications of diabetes, we know that chronic complications of diabetes are strongly linked to how much insulin you shoot into your body. Okay, so if the patient didn't eat chocolate cake all day, the insulin requirement would be very, very low. Basal, in fact. And there's doctors like Troy Stapleton, who's up on the Sunshine Coast. He's a radiologist, and he's got a full database of his blood sugar control over years. And when he stopped eating glucose, his insulin requirement was almost basal. And there's no perturbations that are really difficult to control, because the body's just not being bombarded with glucose all the time. Your listeners might not realize this, but in our whole circulating blood volume, there's 1 teaspoon of glucose. Okay, so around 4 liters of blood that we have circulating in our body, there's 1 teaspoon of glucose. And when you eat a slice of bread, 1 slice of bread is already 3 teaspoons. So imagine what you're dumping into your body when you have a bowl of Wheat Bix or Just Right, or a 200 or 300 gram potato. You're just dumping truckloads of glucose into your body, which then makes your pancreas have to just work overtime, pumping out the insulin to control that blood glucose. And when you do that day in, day out, you develop what's called insulin resistance. And I think I'm safe to say that the insulin resistance phenomenon, or metabolic syndrome, is the most prevalent disease in the world. That's underpinning that is the root cause, the most prevalent disease in the world. It just manifests in people in different ways. So someone might become obese, someone might get diabetes, someone might get a heart attack, someone might get a stroke. But at the seed of all those different conditions, insulin resistance is driving them. And if you're unlucky, you get the full house. You're obese, you have high blood pressure, you have diabetes, you have cancer, and all of the rest of it.
Yeah, the whole gamut.
The whole gamut. Some people might just be obese and not get diabetes, but that's just an effect of their genetic predispositions. But it's still insulin resistance. And harping back to me 10 years ago, I was becoming insulin resistant. That's why I was becoming overweight, and I was becoming hypertensive because of the beginnings of insulin resistance. And you can reverse it, of course. You can reverse it.
And obviously, you were a young man. You look young now. So
well, I'm nearly 50 now. I'm nearly 50. So yeah, I was in my early 40s at that time. So it's not like you're doomed because you've got early insulin resistance. It is entirely reversible. Obviously, the longer you leave it, the harder it is to regain your insulin sensitivity. And I think, that's one of the difficult things that patients have, is that they think it's quite extreme. They think they need to go to extreme measures to regain their insulin sensitivity. And how I try to convey that to patients is that in the beginning, you probably do have to go pretty extreme. You probably really have to get rid of all the sources of glucose that are entering into your diet and just cull them out. But as time goes on, as your insulin sensitivity climbs and your insulin resistance reduces, then you're more able to tolerate a little bit of glucose. So I'm not a Shaolin monk. I will have a burger on a Saturday night. I will have some carbs on the weekend. But Monday to Friday, I'm pretty strict. Okay, I'll just have my eggs, my meats, my fibrous vegetables, my dairy, and really good sources of natural fat. But that I can do that because I've earned the privilege to have some carbs on the weekend. But if I try to do that from a position of poor health, I haven't yet earned that privilege. So you've got to start off fairly strict. You've got to earn that privilege. And I think that sort of harps back to the 80-20 rule. People talk about, everything in moderation, everything in moderation. Well, everything in moderation, 80-20 rule, only applies from a position of health. Okay? If you're obese and you're diabetic and you're hypertensive and you've just had a stroke, I'm sorry, the 80-20 rule doesn't apply, because the house is burning down. You can't go softly. You've got to be a little bit extreme. And then when things are settling down and it's not, everything's starting to get a little bit healthier and you've got that insulin sensitivity, now you can apply the 90-10 rule, say, for instance. So I can have 10. And then you maintain that for another 3 or 4 months, and then you're even healthier. And now your body goes, rightio, you've regained a lot of your insulin sensitivity. I'll allow you to apply the 80-20 rule. And that's when everything in moderation applies, not when you've got full-blown uncontrolled diabetes. And patients sort of have a little bit of difficulty understanding that until you have that conversation with them, because they'll turn around and say, but my sister eats, chocolate cake every night and ice cream for dessert every night, and she's not overweight. Well, what you have to then say is that your sister is not yet insulin resistant. She has not developed glucose intolerance yet, but you have. And so when she eats a chocolate cake, it affects her differently to the way that it affects you when you eat the exact same chocolate cake. It all comes down to, you've allowed your body to become glucose intolerant. She hasn't yet. But it doesn't mean she's not going to. Give her another 5 years and she will become glucose intolerant too. And then the chocolate cake will do the same thing to her as it's currently doing to you. So those are the concepts. And even though they're quite simple to us to understand, because we understand the background science behind it, it does take another layer of time to explain it to patients. But 15 minutes of talking to my patients about those type of concepts can change their life. It can change their life. It can prevent a heart attack. And so I think as a clinician, that's well worth it. And and it's a privilege to be have the opportunity to provide that information to patients. I think doctors who don't do that, like I sometimes wonder, I say, how come your GP hasn't had this conversation? Like, you've come to see me about your brain tumor or your spinal problem. Why isn't your GP talking to you about this? And the system just doesn't seem to, the current system doesn't seem to allow for that, because it's a 15-minute consult. Oh, you need your new script. Okay, I'll write your script. You've got to, like you say, we've got to try to create that groundswell, educate from the grassroots level. make the community understand that they don't have to just treat disease, they can prevent disease.
So when you were in medical school, how much nutrition did you do?
Well, the fundamental science was all there.
Yeah.
The pharmacology, the physiology, understanding what hormones do, endocrinology. We learned all that. That was basic. That was all we covered that in the first 3 years of a 6-year course, and just got examined on it to buggery, like to death. So it was really basic science. But in pure nutrition science, I think it was very poor. That knowledge did not translate to, okay, you've got a patient sitting in front of you who's unhealthy. What are you going to actually say to them? All of that knowledge just goes out the door, and, oh, you've got high cholesterol, I'll write you a prescription for Lipitor, which just completely ignores all of that knowledge that created the, dyslipidemia in the first place. Like, what it's crazy, isn't it? It's like modern medicine just ignores the fundamentals. You've got dyslipidemia, here you go, here's a statin. Rather than going, okay, well, let's fix up this really high triglyceride that you've got by changing your diet, and then I don't need to prescribe you the statin. It's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. But I think people like yourself, establishing these type of academies that educate educators is the way to go, because every one of your students who graduates from your academy is going to educate 10,000 people, and those 10,000 people will educate another. We can't rely on educating, Scott Morrison or the health minister or
I say David Johnson for a health minister. Let's get rid of Greg.
Yeah, I mean, it's beating your head up against a brick wall, because they're too influenced by competing interests. And even though if you did an economic evaluation of how much money the country would save, and you said, here we go, here's 2 economic models, they probably would still be forced into a corner to say, no, we need to have these drugs on the PBS. We need to have these, highly expensive, highly dangerous interventions like bariatric surgery and, cutting out someone's stomach to allow them to lose weight. Like, I've never heard of anything so crazy, but yet it's probably one of the fastest growing, if not the most lucrative field of surgery, bariatric surgery, because we know that 2/3 of people are obese or overweight, and the bariatric surgeons are busier than ever, and a lot of their surgeries fail, and I'd say even more of the surgeries result in people who are lighter but equally unhealthy, because for sure, if you reduce the calories that someone can take into their body because they have no stomach, they will lose weight. But that does not mean that they are healthier. Okay, they're just a skinnier, unhealthier person. And so they're just as susceptible to the heart attack. They're just as susceptible to diabetes. They're just as susceptible to metabolic inflammation. But they think because they're lighter, they're healthier. It's a misguided interpretation of the body weight metric. Body weight is not a valuable metric to use in comparison to insulin resistance.
And I'm hearing younger and younger people having that surgery. I heard of a 25-year-old young man, 25 young man, who went and had it done. And I was, I tried to help him, but he just went for the surgery in the end, because I think he felt it was an easier option. I don't have to change anything. But he had to in the end. He's got to change how much he's eating. He's got to change his diet. He could only do liquid foods for a while. And
pretty
Yeah,
horrendous
I haven't
existence.
seen the result of that. That was quite a few years ago, so I haven't seen the result of
Yeah.
what has happened to him.
Well, he may have lost weight, and he might be sort of saying, "I told you so. I told you I'd lose weight by doing this," but it doesn't mean he's healthy.
Healthy, yeah.
Ideal situation is if they also enhance their diet too. So they lose weight because of the caloric restriction and also change the quality of their calories, then they're going to be a success story. And of course, there are some of those too. I've got a personal friend who's done exactly that. He had the bariatric surgery, and he went low carb, healthy fat, and he just rode his bike from Townsville to Brisbane, in 5 days or something, and is a picture of health. But that's because he's done two things, right? He's achieved the ultimate goal, and he's got his life back. His lifespan is now going to be the same as mine, versus before he was on his way to having a heart attack. He couldn't even complete a exercise stress test on the treadmill. He was about to pass out. So, but again, the message from I can't I can only speak from talking to patients who've had bariatric surgery. I said, did your surgeon talk to you about lowering your carbohydrate intake? No. They talked to me about the risks of bariatric surgery, that I might die during the surgery. But they didn't talk to me about what I have to eat. And I think a lot of the surgeons, the bariatric surgeons, will pass off that obligation to their dietitian. And, we know what the dietary guidelines are. The bottom rung base foundation of the dietary food pyramid is 8 servings of carbohydrate a day.
Used to be 11. Used to be 9 to 11.
Yeah.
So they pulled it down a little bit. Yeah.
Mm. So, I'll ask you, Cyndi, why do you think that has the case? Why is the base of the pyramid so high in carbohydrate? What do you think?
Well, we go back in history. I'm a history buff in everything that I do. I want to know, well, why did we start using margarine as opposed to butter? When did that happen? How was it made? What was it made for? So I love the history. So the history of the dietary guidelines really started in the US. And there were two industries that were competing, and that was the meat and dairy industry and the grain industry. And the industry that ended up winning was the grain industry. So that was the bottom of the pyramid. And if you go back and read all about that in the 70s, and Belinda Fetke is brilliant at this, her history lesson on the dietary guidelines and how this vegetarian and vegan push is happening at the moment, or more vegan push. So if we go back in history, that started back in the 20s and 30s in a religious sect with Kellogg's, So when I look at the history of it, that's where it's come from, despite all the research that showed that fat wasn't the problem and that sugar was, one over the other. So last week we had the whole salt debacle about white salt's better than pink salt. Well, I read the study. I looked at who the company was that did the study, and I see that there's this manipulation of studies and the words that come out in marketing that then convince the population to consume the food that they want you to consume, which is white salt, white bread, white pasta, white rice. It used to be 9 to 11 servings, now it's 8. So to me, we go back in history and we can see where we've made our mistakes. And it's people like you that have figured out, oops, and it was a personal, and it usually is always with, I'm finding with people is very personal, or a real, like Gary was, I'm cutting people's legs off, Gary Fedke, I'm taking people's legs and limbs off because of their diabetes. And Dr. James Muki, these people are going blind because of what they're consuming and the diabetes problem. So you can see it's either a personal thing or we become educated and we understand why this is happening. Yeah.
I think that sounds right, and I've heard Belinda talk a lot about that as well. And I think sometimes to think that science is not political is probably a bit naive. I think science can be very political. Everything that drives science is actually has probably a political origin. And like we knew in the 50s that smoking was bad for you, but it wasn't until years and years later we had the science that smoking was causing lung cancer, but the politics of the day were never going to allow that science to emerge. And I think in terms of nutrition, I think there's a US President Eisenhower, I think, and he had a heart attack. Mm-hmm. And never mind that he was a prolific smoker. They started to vilify the fats in his diet. And Ansel Keys was sort of part of the advisory group and came out with his sort of landmark but incorrect conclusion that the fats were the 7 countries study, where he really just misinterpreted the data, unfortunately, and fat was sort of blamed as the cause of heart disease. And all of a sudden you have this perfect storm where the grain and cereal industry was trying to just get traction, and there was the Vietnam War and a lot of other stuff that they were trying to boost the economy. So the grain and cereal industry just exploded, and fats were there as the bad guy. And so industrial oils replaced butter and ghee and lard and tallow, and we started trimming off the fat off our bacon, off our everything. It was trim meat, and it's taking us a long time to recover from that. It's taking us a long time to recover from that because the grain and cereal industry is, and like you said, Kellogg's, it's $1 billion multinational industry. So it's very hard to stop that tsunami of misinformation. If you want to be extreme, you can call it propaganda. It's very hard to stop that.
Yeah.
But,
and it's interesting. My husband always says, when you have a big movement happening and it's like a freight train moving down the tracks, it's very hard to slow it down and turn it around. Mm-hmm. But as individuals, we're like jet skis. Mm-hmm. We can stop, turn, change, do whatever we need to do. So to change that freight train, which is the grain industry, which is the breakfast cereal industry, which is the pharmaceutical industry, which is the agricultural industry, to change that now, it's a freight train that is out of control. So we have to jump off that freight train, get on our jet skis, and realize that we have power over those industries by not buying their products, and by looking at where your food is coming from, looking at real food, of course, all the time. Then you as an individual have more power than ever you'll ever think you can. And that's what we do at the Nutrition Academy is say we're not going to give power and money to those industries anymore, to the food industries that create foods out of synthetic biology or whatever it is that they're doing with their food additives, their flavors, their thickness, their starches, their binders, their colors. It's just ridiculous. There's not even
food science. Yeah.
It's food science that is killing us. So yeah, I'm very much get off the freight train, become educated. You as an individual have power. Don't purchase their products, and they'll have to change. And you see, like when I started this, there was no organic industry.
Yeah.
But now that organic industry is growing, there was no regen farming, and now regen farming is growing. I could hardly find a doctor to speak to that would not insult me. This 40 years ago, they just thought margarine is good, Cyndi, butter's bad. What are you talking about? You have no idea what you're talking about. So I am seeing this incredible change. Like all I seem to be talking to is enlightened doctors. And it's so wonderful to be a part of that now. So
you have good days and you have bad days, don't you? Sometimes you sort of, because we sort of surround ourselves by people who have the same mindset, you think, oh yeah, everyone's on board. And then you jump on Twitter or you jump on social media and you see all this absolute garbage come out, or you see a research paper that's funded by the pharmaceutical company or the grain and cereal industry. And oh my God, that's just like set us back another, 5 years, because we just established that bit of science got out there finally. And then suddenly it's all hocus pocus again.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing. I go in August, I think it was, I was traveling, and when I travel, I read papers. And I read The Australian, and on the back page of The Australian, it was one of the Life Matters ones, and they were talking about the saturated fat issue. So I thought, yay, this is out plain. Everybody should have read that article and realized that saturated fat is okay. But it just got sideswiped, I think, yet again.
Yeah, but I mean, Australian Heart Foundation, if you just Google AHA, they still are very anti-saturated fat. And there is not one skerrit of reliable scientific evidence that suggests that saturated fat is responsible for coronary artery disease. There's just not. But you wonder who is allowing such an organisation, because it's respected. It's an authority figure that people turn to. People aren't going to Google what does Dr. Johnson think about saturated fat, but they're going to Google the Australian Heart Foundation, and throughout that website is just bashing saturated fat. It's really, really, really hard, and it's sometimes it's a little bit demoralizing. But when I sit down and have conversations with people like yourself and Christine, you get a bit of an uplift. And when you see your patients come through the door and they say, yep, blood pressure's down, off those drugs, out there running around playing sport again, and they've got their life back, that sort of keeps you boosted up. But
it does, and not everybody's going to change, but the people that do change, they're very grateful. You mentioned something towards the beginning, and I really want to ask you this question. You mentioned the mitochondria. So would you, like a lot of people are saying it's like we have mitochondria disease, we talked about metabolic disease, but would you talk about why you mentioned the mitochondria and how that is now relating to many diseases that we're seeing now? And especially as opposed to having sugar, protein, ketones, or being in ketosis, how that relates to that.
Well, a lot of people probably don't really have a concept of what a mitochondria is, but basically every cell of our body has these little organelles within them, and there's a little structure called the mitochondria, and it is really often referred to as like the battery of the cell, so to speak, and that is where our cell generates energy. And we talk about energy being in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And for a cell to keep working, it needs to create ATP. And we can create ATP from carbohydrates, or we can create ATP from our fats or our protein. When we continue to derive energy from carbohydrates, we create a underlying sort of milieu of inflammation, because the byproducts of metabolizing carbohydrate results in what we call free radicals. And free radicals are like rust that occurs on something that you leave out in the yard, your rake or something like that. We call it oxidation, oxidative stress. It's the same sort of chemical process, and obviously it's happening at a cellular level. So it's not like you're rusting inside, but from a chemical perspective, essentially that's what's happening within your cells. if you are continuing to derive your energy from carbohydrates. And over years, that can create these diseases and insulin resistance. So what we are understanding with mitochondrial dysfunction is that the diet can cause a dysfunction of those mitochondria, which then sends a chemical signal to the nucleus, and the nucleus then has DNA disruption, and the DNA disruption then leads to abnormal cell replication, which is the beginning of malignancy, because cells rely on their DNA to reproduce and divide, and it's very tightly controlled. So if you have any abnormality of that regulation, and that abnormal cell can keep dividing and dividing and dividing, eventually that sort of overthrows the healthy cells, and you then have a cohort of very abnormal dysplastic cells, which is the beginning of your cancer. So rather than thinking, oh, the cancer started because of an abnormality in the genome, we have to and that is correct, because we can identify genes that are abnormal in cancer cells. But what we're not thinking about is, how did those genes become abnormal? Why did they start driving abnormal replication? And if we take it back one step further, which is what some of the research that D'Agostino and those guys are doing, is realizing that there's a chemical messenger that comes from a dysfunctional mitochondria that travels into the nucleus where the DNA is, and that abnormal messenger is being derived from a dysfunctional mitochondria. And then why did the mitochondria become dysfunctional? The diet is what's sort of setting you up for that. And so in a susceptible person, then they're really setting themselves up to develop a cancer because of their bad diet. So it's like, that's deep diving into the science, and but it sort of, it makes sense. It fits the model of a metabolic cause of cancer. It actually fits the model better than a genetic cause of cancer. I think if some of your viewers want to read a book that's written for non-medical people, I would recommend buying a book called Tripping Over the Truth. Tripping Over the Truth, and it's by a guy called, I think his last name is Christofferson. I can't remember his name. I think it might be Travis Christofferson or something like that. I was going to say Chris Christopherson, but that's a Hollywood actor. It's not Chris Christopherson, but his last name is Christofferson.
Yep.
And the book is definitely called Tripping Over the Truth. Very good book.
And it's about the mitochondria?
It does talk about that. Yes, absolutely. It does talk about that.
I haven't heard it, so I'll grab it.
Yeah. So that's where that comes into the picture with mitochondrial disease.
You explained that absolutely brilliantly. I think the best I've ever heard it explained. So thank you so much. One of the things that our students learn is seasonal eating. So if we take out, once again, history buffing, anthropology is what I did when I went to university, is we look at the way that we did eat. We had times of plenty. We stayed in one place, had carbohydrates, had plants, had fruits, things like that. Then we had times of only meat or dairy products were available with very little plant food. And so we do talk about that cyclical way of consuming food, whereas in the Australian population as well as the world, we're on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Supermarkets are open. You can have carbohydrates. You never have to move an inch in order to get your food.
Yeah, you can have a juicy mango every day of the year.
Yep. And so you explain
it?
that importance of, you cannot just stay on those foods. You have to do, because like you said, once we're well, we can start to eat some carbohydrates again on occasion.
Exactly right.
So you've done
so
that.
Like that's exactly what you would probably lose a little bit of insulin sensitivity in the summertime, and then in the wintertime you would regain it. Okay, that's you keeping things in check. And I asked Belinda Fetke about some people in tropical countries where they would probably have fruit and fructose all year round. And one of the things that people in tropical countries have is they have a heck of a lot of sunlight, and their vitamin D levels are high. And so they have a very natural antioxidant that's part of their lifestyle, part of their environment. So you've got these competing factors that keep you healthy. Whereas, in modern society, we spend 12, 14 hours indoors, and then we have all our sugar and glucose every day, and we're not getting those anti-inflammatory factors that are driving health back into our body. We're not moving well. We're not getting those physical elements that drive insulin sensitivity back up. We're not sleeping well. Stress. All of these factors are promoting metabolic inflammation, and the balance just tips in favor of you developing, with absolute physiological certainty, developing chronic disease. And it's just crazy that there's so many people now that are unhealthy and just are lost in terms of how to get out of that quicksand. And one of my sayings is, being healthy should be simple. Like, was there universities 5,000 years ago? Was there books? Did we have the internet? Did we have Google? No, we didn't have any of that. We just saw a pig or a duck or a fish, and we just went and we just ate it. We didn't have to research or go to university to become nutritionists or dietitians and know how to be healthy. But in actual fact, we probably were metabolically healthier thousands of years ago than we are now, with all of the education and science that is at our fingertips, a computer screen away. But being healthy should be very, very simple. And like you said, just eat real food. Eat it as if it was in season. If it's not a mango season, you shouldn't be eating a mango, because evolutionary biology says that you weren't able to eat that mango in the middle of winter, thousands of years ago.
I agree with you. Now, I do have one more question, and it's about children. Do you have children as your patients?
Yeah. As patients, I treat teenagers, but I don't have young children. I don't do any pediatric surgery.
So,
but I've got two crazy kids of my own.
Oh, you've got, yeah. Okay, so maybe you can answer the question. So the statistics show us from 2018 that 38 to 40% of our kids have chronic diseases, if not 1, 2, or 3. What do you think is causing this?
Well, I think those pillars, we talked about those pillars of health. By absolutely, the diet is a huge factor. I went to my daughter's graduation, and I watched the kids come up and receive their awards on awards night, and not one child walked up with tall shoulders. They're all like this, rounded shoulders, necks down like this. Okay, so physicality, the functional capacity of children these days is in their boots. Sometimes we have teenagers come to our functional movement training center, and they have no functional capacity. We have to retrain their biomechanics, their musculoskeletal health, because for some reason they're not allowed to do cartwheels at school anymore, because the school might get sued if someone hurts their wrist or neck or something, and that's a fact. Actually, the school that I'm associated with, that ban doing cartwheels. But so musculoskeletal health is poor. We spend way too much time at a computer screen on our mobile phones, or doing homework on computer screens. And the education department is pushing wholeheartedly for paperless education. But has anyone thought about what that does to a child after 6 years of studying at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night whilst looking at a computer screen? with most likely little notifications bleeping every half hour saying, hey, look at me, hey, look at this photo, hey, look, you know, distracting them from the actual task. Like, these things are not, they just haven't been well thought out. Technology for technology's sake. And that's going to be emerging science too, as to what blue light is going to have on our pineal glands and our melatonin. I think that's still to sort of be really deeply explored, but I'm sure that it's going to have an effect on our kids. But probably the most significant factor will be diet. I think that really is, that's going to be the foundation stone of everything that happens above. If we
Sounds
get our
almost
kids
like
diet.
diet and movement by the sounds of it, like.
They're the two big pillars that we can make a massive change with.
So I'm going to put it in the show notes anyway for all my students and graduates, but let people know where they can find you, because I'm sure if anybody has any issues, especially if they live in the Queensland area or even the New South Wales area, they might want to see you as opposed to somebody who's not thinking like you are. So let them know how they can find you. I know you talked about you've got quite a few functional movement places.
Melatonin, and that to a child is pushing wholeheartedly for might get sued if someone hurts their wrist or neck or something, and that's a fact actually. The school that I'm associated with, that banned doing cartwheels. But so musculoskeletal health is poor. We spend way too much time at a computer screen on our mobile phones, or doing homework on computer screens. And the education department is pushing wholeheartedly for paperless education. But has anyone thought about what that does to a child after 6 years of studying at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night whilst looking at a computer screen, with most likely little notifications bleeping every half hour saying, hey, look at me, hey, look at this photo, hey, look, distracting them from the actual task. Like, these things are not, they just haven't been well thought out. Technology for technology's sake. And that's going to be emerging science too, as to what blue light is going to have on our pineal glands and our melatonin. I think that's still to sort of be really deeply explored, but I'm sure that it's going to have an effect on our kids. But probably the most significant factor will be diet. I think that really is, that's going to be the foundation stone of everything that happens above. If we
Sounds
get our
almost
kids
like diet and movement by the sounds of it, like.
They're the two big pillars that we can make a massive change with.
So I'm going to put it in the show notes anyway for all my students and graduates, but let people know where they can find you, because I'm sure if anybody has any issues, especially if they live in the Queensland area or even the New South Wales area, they might want to see you as opposed to somebody who's not thinking like you are. So let them know how they can find you. I know you talked about you've got quite a few functional movement places. So let them know websites, everything.
So in terms of your musculoskeletal health, my major area of interest in terms of medicine is spine pain. So we have a very big contingent of staff that looks after back pain in particular. Back pain is the leading musculoskeletal disorder on the planet. There's about 3 million people in Australia with back pain. And
in Australia?
In Australia, yep. 3 million people in Australia with back pain right now. Chronic back pain, which means that it's been present for more than 6 months. And our functional movement training centre and rehabilitation program, of course, is available in Brisbane. And we also have a service on the Sunshine Coast for back pain and neck pain. We've also just started a service up in Gympie and Bundaberg. So it's slowly getting out there, but it's got a lot of, there are a lot of alternatives that people have for back pain. Just drive around the streets, you'll see your chiropractors, your Pilates, your physiotherapists, your gyms, your acupuncture, you name it. And all of these services appear to be addressing back pain symptoms, but they're not addressing the cause of back pain. Okay, and so my philosophy is, if you're going to have a real success, you've got to address the root cause, the seed of the problem. And the seed of the problem of your back pain comes from biomechanical movement dysfunction. So that's what that's what we really specialize in. And you only end up needing to have the scalpel if you leave it too late. If you don't rectify your biomechanical movement dysfunction, you will continue to get biomechanical stress, which drives biological inflammation. Biological inflammation drives structural breakdown of your spinal joints, your discs, your facet joints. And then once that facet joint or disc is too far gone, I'm sorry, you have left it too late, and you're going to require a surgery. But if you sort of fix those biomechanical problems early on, when you get that bit of niggly back pain or that niggly neck pain, and you see a functional movement therapist, and our program is called NeuroHab. So if you see a NeuroHab functional movement therapist, then you can change that course, that you can change that future. And so if you want to get in touch with me, please give us a call. I'd love to hear from you. St Andrew's Hospital at Spring Hill in Brisbane. Yep. And our email, probably the best email would be info, I-N-F-O, info at F for Fred, MTC, so that stands for Functional Movement Training Centre, info at fmtc.com.au.
Perfect. And that's your website as well, fmtc.com.au?
Yeah, that's for our Functional Movement Training Centre website. And then we've also got my neurosurgery website, which is just City to Coast Neurosurgery.
Well, I just know that our common client just raves over you. So they're just so happy. And, you know, what I love about those two is that they've done it together. So he had to change and she changed with him. And she's just doing brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. I love it. I love watching it. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, well, thanks for looking after them and thanks for keeping them on the right track. You've made my job a lot easier, that's for sure.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Cyndi, lovely chatting. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.